Hey, everybody, welcome back. It's going to be a great day today in our quest to discover more military people who have seen things. I can't think of one more than a handful than Ryan Graves, somebody who is speaking from his own personal experiences and not just somebody trying to put down the phenomenon. And Jason, how many people in military and government have that kind of closed mind? And even if they have or have not seen anything, they just become debunkers.
Yeah, and that happens all the time, and we mention it quite a bit, but the true disclosure comes from the men and women in the service that have had experiences, that have had sightings or close encounters, and we've interviewed quite a bit of them now. But this is the first time we've had a Navy fighter pilot coming to the podcast and talking about it, and it's none other than Ryan Graves, which is important because, we'll get into it with him, but these are the most trained observers in the world, and if they can't identify something with all their devices and their knowledge, we should be paying attention.
Yeah. And good on them for providing that safe space to people who want to come forward, maybe don't know much about this. I mean, we just take for granted that why don't these pilots just come forward? But it might be a topic they're scared of, right? The whole UFO tinfoil hat wearing thing is an image people don't want to associate with, especially if you have a career that depends on your sanity and how accurately you observe things. So it is a big deal when somebody from the Air Force or somebody who's a Navy fighter pilot, a pilot regardless, is willing to put their neck out and say, no, it's not just me, it's others, and I'm going to create that safe space. So we're going to find out about his events that happened in 2013, 14, as always, and then find out about his new podcast. And recently, just a couple of days ago, he came out with a new advocacy group. So we're going to ask him all the big questions.
He's a busy boy.
Yeah, he's a busy guy, and good on him.
Yeah,
good on him. He's our kind of guy. So with that, we'll be right back with Ryan Graves on UAP Studies Podcast. Welcome back to another episode of UAP Studies Podcast. My name is Louis Borges. Joining me as always, my good buddy, Jason Gilmet.
How's it going, Louis?
It's going good. It's a great day today. Another illustrious guest in our quest to get more military people, more actual boots on the ground guys who've seen crazy things. And like you just said in our intro there, disclosure is probably going to come through these men and women in the military because they're such good observers. And our guest today is no stranger to any of this. We've got Ryan Graves on the show today, former Navy FA-18 Super Hornet pilot, a military officer who saw UAP activity, and so did the rest of his squadron. He's also the founder of a new advocacy initiative, Americans for Safe Aerospace, and has his own amazing show called Merge Podcast. We'll get into all that today. But first, a very warm welcome to our guest today, Mr. Ryan Graves.
Well, thanks for having me here. I appreciate both of you, and thank you.
Yeah, let's have a little bit of fun. So I'm sure you've told your story many times, not to make it one of those things that you hate bringing up, but if you could just briefly explain, because I do think it's important that if somebody isn't quite familiar with what all happened in 2013, 2014, I think it's important to set that stage. So tell us a little bit about what happened during your military service.
Yeah, certainly. So I joined the Navy, started flying F-18s, and I ended up joining the Squadron VFA 11, the Red Rippers, in 2012, I believe it was, maybe late 2011. But I met them out on their deployment. And so went from being a flight student one day, and about 2 weeks later, I was on an aircraft carrier, lugging my gear downstairs, sweating like crazy in the Middle East. Moving in, essentially. And a couple weeks after that, I did my first combat deployment. But we were out there for about 4.5 months or so, and then we headed home. And once we came back, we essentially slowed down our operational tempo and entered a maintenance phase, it's called. So we're still flying, but at a reduced schedule, and some of our jets get some overdue maintenance on certain things. And one of those was to upgrade our radar, was from the APG-73 to the APG-79. It's a pretty big difference, much more fidelity, and break things out at better ranges, things of that nature. But still, it's just a radar, so it operates the same way. So it's a pretty easy transition, except we were noticing more objects on the radar than we were used to seeing just, say, the other day with the older radar. And this was in our working areas that we fly off of, which is right off the coast of Virginia Beach. And so normally we wouldn't have anything out there. We check in, we go flying in this big box in the sky over the ocean there. Then we upgrade our radars, and again, now there's things out there that our radars is suggesting to us that they're in our working areas. And at first, we didn't think they were actually physical objects, just due to the suddenness of the contacts and due to the upgrade. We thought they were some type of radar error, perhaps, that was inherent in the software, and it wouldn't be a surprise necessarily because we often had those type of issues with older radars. Things get changed, and there's a problem. These theoretically were supposed to solve a lot of those issues, but here we are still seeing them. So, I guess it's a work in progress. But when we fly around out there with those radar systems, all our other sensors that are on the jet look where our radar is pointed, essentially. So although we weren't really respecting these as physical objects, our radar is still pinging them. And as we would fly close to them, our cameras would essentially slew over to look at them. And so that's when we noticed that they were actually giving off IR energy from those points that were on the radar. And, and it just looked like, it's just like a camera image, and it looks like a normal camera image, or we can switch it to the IR mode or infrared mode. And then we're looking at heat energy. And we would see what almost like a flashlight shining at us from that point, but very, distinct IR energy coming from that exact point. So at this point, we had to conclude they were physical objects. And that was kind of it for the time being. We didn't really have like an assessment of what they were, whether they were some kind of weird debris or what have you. But we weren't really also like talking about it and analyzing it. So it's hard to really say what, we thought they were at this point. It was kind of more of just, there was no real deep analysis. We just were starting to recognize that they were a potential problem because we had to respect them as physical objects, and they were enough of them out there to be bothersome to our flight training. Then eventually someone from my squadron, 2 aircraft, so four someones, saw one of the objects with their own eyes. They were flying out to that box in the sky, and there's a very specific altitude and GPS location where we enter the area, and then about 1,000 feet below, exactly 1,000 feet. At the same point, the traffic is departing those working areas. So it's actually a very busy piece of sky. It's probably one of the busiest pieces of sky on the eastern seaboard, to be honest. Anyways, so they were hitting that point, that entry point, and they're in a formation like this. And right at that point, one of these objects went right between the section of aircraft, and the lead flight saw it, saw the object with his own eyes, and assessed it as a near midair, could physically see the object. The wingman -2 could not see it, or not that he could not see it, but he did not see it. He wasn't, and that doesn't surprise me because you're so focused on flying formation. That's all he's looking at, focused on, not even his own instruments. So that doesn't surprise me that he didn't see it. But Lee did see it, and he just described it as a dark gray or black cube inside of a clear sphere. And I don't think it was moving at that point. I think it was stationary at that point, right at that GPS location. And he ended up knocking it off and coming back home at that point, and then telling everyone in the ready room they almost hit one of those damn things. And then we filed a safety report on it. So that's kind of how I was introduced to these. I'll stop here because, I don't want to keep going too much without giving you guys an opportunity to ask questions. But that's kind of where we got to the point where, hey, this is now like a no shit problem for us. We're almost hitting these things. We have to file safety reports. And that was in a sense, our introduction as far as it could take us on the conclusion train, that we were just like, all right, these things are physical. We don't know what these are. They're strange. And that was really it, because we were leaving for deployment not too long after that. Just a few months, excuse me, not necessarily deployment, but for the workup cycle for deployment. And so we left, eventually packed up our stuff, moved on to an aircraft carrier, essentially flew out onto it. And that was a USS Theodore Roosevelt, ended up off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, and we're still seeing these objects down there. And then on one of our flights, we record the gimbal object, the gimbal video, the go fast video, on one of our training flights, and came back to the aircraft carrier. That was a unique situation for us because we had not seen that object before, the gimbal object with that distinct shape, or the mechanics it displayed, or the formation of objects and how they were flying. So that was a pretty unique experience, but seemed to be part of that larger issue of objects. You know, we thought they were, from our conclusion, essentially a part of the same thing, but displaying new behaviors, not new things and new behaviors, if that makes sense. And so that was that. You know, we went, did our training, you know, kept seeing them. There's obviously more to that story, but again, without going into too much, we leave in our deployment. I'm done with the squadron about halfway through that deployment, and I come back. I go to my next training station, or my duty station, which is in Meridian, Mississippi. And then I become an advanced strike fighter instructor for about 3.5 years, training the people going to fly the F-18. And it was there when I was hanging out in 2017 when the New York Times article came out. And I saw it on the couch, and I was like, oh, that's the video that, you know, I saw taken, and those are my buddies' voices and all that. And then I kind of checked in with everyone, and I said, you know, my buddies that were still flying on the East Coast and elsewhere, and I kind of was just like, is this still like an issue? You know, is this still like a thing? And because I kind of had just assumed it stopped for some reason, but they're like, yeah, still going on. We now have like NOTAMs up, which are notice to airmen to say, you know, just like permanent notices to say, hey, unknown objects operating out here, be cautious, because they're just here. And that was it. And that's kind of when I was like, well, nothing, you know, this is still going on. Nothing's changing. And that's when I sent an email to the Stars Academy email address. I found their website after seeing that video leaked, or however it came out, and just simply said, hey, you know, I was there when it was taken. I can try to answer any questions for you about the video or the circumstances if you like. And that was kind of my initial foray, you could say.
Yeah, and you didn't stop from there. It seemed like you became more and more known within the community, or the UFO people that have been, you know, watching this development over the last few years. You've been very active. And that's what's impressive, is that you're actually the first fighter pilot that we've had on. We've had military personnel. Kevin Day was on, former military personnel as well, and he was, I think, the radar operator on the Princeton. I want to say, I'm bad with names, but I think that was what he did. Right. And it affected him on a personal level, like having gone through this. Like he said, you know, when he watched the news clip on TV, he broke down, like he was at a golf resort or something, bringing plates, dropped the plates. He was just so emotional from seeing this play out on the TV. Did you have a similar emotional reaction to that, like seeing that this is actually brought up, that this is a serious issue, and some of it you've had a big part to play in?
No, I didn't have that type of reaction personally, but you know, when you're and this isn't me tooting my horn, this is just like a general statement on that community. You know, we're pretty narrowly focused on our duties, and for us, it's very action orientated solutions. So, you know, my solution was to, you know, try to bring some awareness to the issue so that people could start proactively treating this as the safety issue it was, versus waiting for someone to hit one of these objects and take out a jet, and then, you know, maybe or maybe not, we piece together exactly what happened, and maybe we go forward from there. And that's something I've seen a lot. The Navy trained me as an aviation safety officer. They sent me down to Pensacola, Florida for about 5 weeks to go through, you know, 8-hour-a-day classroom type training to not only prevent mishaps, but when they do inevitably occur, you know, I was the one responsible for actually going out to the crash site, picking up the pieces, and then putting them back together to figure out, you know, what happened. And unfortunately, I had to do that a couple times. But it's you know, if anything, that's what they trained me to do. And this just seemed like going through that process through the channels that were available to me. So that's how I reacted to it.
It amazed me to hear that you said some of these things they'd be out there like 12 hours a day, just sometimes sitting there, sometimes moving, sometimes in winds as high as like 120 knots, or I think that's like 140 miles an hour. I mean, even if you had high end tech that we have, there's no way it's just going to sit there unaffected. And wind isn't always constant, right? It'll gust and then it'll stop, it'll come from another direction. So, and if you've seen the gimbal video, it doesn't look like anything aerodynamic. It looks like a mushroom on its side leaning into the wind, and nothing really seemed to matter. And you know, you mentioned your buddies were on the tape and you can hear the excitement in their voice, like, my gosh, because it's just everything you've been taught and everything you've thought you know about aerospace. And as a pilot, you got to have a pretty good understanding of that. And it's all like out the window, like, what the hell is that? And how is it even flying like that? And I can just imagine what went through their minds when they see that, you know?
Hmm.
What creeped me
Yeah.
out the most? Oh, sorry, Ryan. I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
No,
So
no worries.
what creeped me out the most is hearing, yeah, there's a whole fleet of them.
Yeah.
And like, what? Like, that got my hair on my arms just to stand up. Like, there's a whole fleet of them. Like, that's insane. Capturing one's insane, but capturing multiple like that, it's got to do something to you guys, the most trained observers in the world, to not be able to identify what these things are.
I think our natural reaction was to be as pragmatic about it as possible. And for us, that's the essentially, as fighter pilots, that means just staying away from them, essentially, right? Like just classifying it as a potential mid-air risk, and then assessing it like we would for any other potential mid-air risk, whether it be, balloon or something that we just simply don't know what it is, or assessing it that bumbles in, which is to essentially call it out when we see it, stay away from it. Um, so that was kind of essentially the only take we could really do. And again, we don't really have any tools or sensors up there. I mean, we have tools, we have sensors, but they're not designed for investigating, right? The information that's presented to us is filtered and presented in a tactical format, right? So we don't see like an analog spectrum and say, oh well, that's weird, that's way over here. It's just
Right.
not how it works. It'll classify things as jamming or this or that, just because it doesn't know what it is.
I've heard some people try to kind of cast doubt on some of the pilots' testimony and say, well, as well trained as they are, they're still humans and they could mistake it for a balloon or something like that. And
Seagulls. Yeah.
yeah, like it's just an insult, in my opinion. And I'm sure you guys feel the same. But in your personal case, like you've got a degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering. So anything that's a machine or flies, you have a degree in it. You know what the hell you're talking about, aside from your pilot training. Like that alone is enough to make you an amazing observer. So for some people to just say, well, pilots are only people. No, no, it's not like that. You guys training, everything in your lives is geared towards being better at your job and understanding the workings of those kind of things. So when you guys are saying this stuff, people need to listen and take it seriously.
Well, I'm not going to disagree that people need to listen and take it serious, but I will say the degree doesn't provide me any special screen of infallibility. Things can change quite fast, and so can technology trends. But that aside, I'll say yes. Generally speaking, that is our job as fighter pilots, to recognize what's up there. And so, that is one of the most important things we do. Because if we can't tell who is friendly or who's a foe, then we can't shoot missiles at them.
Yeah.
And that goes back to, Vietnam War, and we learned a lot of lessons there. And so much of our sensor systems and technologies are based just on that, knowing, who's who in the zoo, as we say. And then when we transition from, once we actually know who's who and we start prosecuting those targets, the second most important consideration is the distance off our nose, essentially. How far away are we from those targets or the closest target? And that's going to drive the threat range from the overall group, theoretically. And there's all sorts of considerations, and it gets very technical. But you really break it down, think very simply, it's, those two considerations. And what's interesting is that people like to cast doubt on is that, we've spent years training to do this. We're operating the best equipment in the world to do this thing. We just executed on an air-to-air training mission with fully capable systems when we came back, and the only skeptical or the only kind of argument against that is, the sensors didn't work correctly, or the pilots had some type of error knowing how far it was off their nose. Which again, these are like the core elements of being a fighter pilot that we've been training for 12 hours a day for years. And again, it doesn't mean we're infallible, but the type of attacks don't make sense, and it's just spinning us around wheels and not really moving anything forward.
Right. And now you've been more active on the political side as well, bringing this forward to Congress. I know you've been friends with Leslie Kane, and you guys have been really working hard behind the scenes. Can we talk a little bit about what that was like for you to step into the political realm and bring this forward to the government of the United States? Like that was a huge moment.
I wouldn't, yeah. I mean, in a sense, I wouldn't even consider it a political thing. I think you're referring to the first time I spoke or testified, you could say, about this. Is that kind of the
Yeah.
kind of coming forward you're talking about? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't call it, getting into politics or anything like that. These were just problems in the way of better understanding this, and these were the right tools in order to affect that change. And at first, maybe not first, but there's the AIAA, American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, which is a science and engineering effort, right? And that attacks a very specific problem. And then with Americans for Safe Aerospace, that is a policy and issue focused activism group and organization. So not politics, right? These are just tools of how can we help move the conversation forward with the tools of the people, of the decision makers that need to make these decisions. How can we provide them the right information and the right ability to make decisions on this topic in a way that's best for, what we want to do, our mission, which is to move this conversation forward and to understand what's above our heads.
Yeah.
And so, I'll just say I don't see this as getting in politics in any sense, and none of my actions. I see this as more of just, these are the right tools for the right job. And way back when I first spoke to the Senate Armed Service Committee, that was the really only way we could get attention on this. It had been briefed all the way up to the strike group admiral, and we still had no communication on it. That kind of communication into this, or the briefing to the Senate Armed Service Committee and Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Chris Mellon helped arrange that through his network. And that was, after Dave Fravor's testimony, one of the first interactions that they had on the awareness that this has been happening, not just since 2004, but now happening since about 2013, at least on the Eastern Coast, or at least since we've been detecting it. So anyways, I feel like I'm back to my story now versus answering your question, but I don't know, that's just how I feel about it.
Yeah.
And to that point that you just made there, like your events were what, 2013, 2014 time
That's
frame?
when we started to see them, yeah.
Yeah, and if you look at the Tic Tac video and the Nimitz, that's 2004. So all these videos kind of came out in 2017 when the New York Times did the article. But in terms of timeline, there's a 10-year gap between the Tic Tac and the gimbal video. It's not like it just went dry for 10 years. This stuff has been going on and is continuing to go on in enough volume that, it's becoming a problem. So when you read some of these congressional reports where they're like, we don't really think there's any threat or this and that. I'm not a big threat narrative guy in terms of like, let's just spend more on military. But I am an advocate of, if the pilots don't even know what the hell these things are, somebody's going to hit it. Something is going to happen and an innocent life or lives could be lost. So, in terms of just knowing your adversaries, you have to know what this type of thing is regardless. Even if you're not an alien believer, finding out what it is, I think, is intrinsic, because we have military people. Just if you just look at this 10-year window, that's enough to say, hey, we need to look at this more. But this has been going on for decades, and people in the military, even Robert Salas, that's like a 40-year-old story now, right? So this is nothing new, but I think it's good that guys like yourself aren't scared to talk and are bringing this to the forefront. And, you were on Joe Rogan the other day. You had a great interview. One of the things you said, I actually liked it, because we're UAP studies and we get a lot of fun and people poking fun at us saying it's UFO, not UAP. And he asked you about that too and said, what is it? Is it like a stigmatic term or what? And you said, the term UFO has a lot of assumptions baked into it. And I was like cheering on my end, because I totally agree. And a UFO is basically an unidentified flying object. But there's been anomalous things people have reported that aren't flying objects, right? They could be lights or orbs or energy, or, even if you want to get into like the poltergeist world, that's not a flying object, but it's some kind of anomalous phenomenon. So what are your thoughts on that whole UFO term? Is it good we've made the switch, and why do you think we have?
Yeah, I do think it's good we made the switch, and I stand by what I said before about the assumptions baked in. But I think part of it too is with the stigma. There's cultural assumptions and baggage associated with it as well. From the very first movies on this topic to
Yeah.
just all the other complications to this that people associate various emotions and things to this, which make them respond certain ways when someone approaches them with it. UAP is a little different, I think, because most people don't know what it is. So they get a chance to explain it first from a point where there are no preconceptions. And so if we have good ambassadors on the topic, then hopefully we can communicate that well. So I think it's good that it's done that. I think it was good that the terminology has been updated as well, at least according to the Department of Defense through the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023, utilizing the term anomalous phenomenon, so unidentified anomalous phenomenon versus aerial or aerospace. And cultural stigma and baggage and all that aside, I think it's a sad state of affairs, but at least we're moving in the right direction. That some of this might be caused due to the way we separate the divisions of responsibility in our Department of Defense. Air is controlled by one person, space is controlled by another group, the maritime environment is controlled by another, and we're saying what domain these objects belong to in the very name. And so it's just, if people wanted to make it difficult, well, then they had a very good way to do so. Because like I say, it's either is or is not my problem, and a lot of name games. So, my perception is that the move to this more agnostic naming model is good, and will hopefully help move past that side as well.
And you brought up a good point too, that it has all these different elements, all these different departments, and different people in charge with this phenomenon. There's when it's in the air, when it's in space, when it's in the water, when it lands on the ground. It's all different departments that are in charge of investigating this, but it's all part of the same phenomenon. We've been talking to a lot of people that have had experiences with the so-called occupants of these crafts. So again, is that something that with disclosure, or maybe the more open this subject becomes, this becomes more of a possibility now that people have actually had these encounters with occupants of crafts that they can't identify as being human, the same as we can't identify what these crafts are. Do you think that's coming down eventually as something that maybe CNN will be able to report on? Because right now that's taboo, right? We're okay with talking about the disclosure on the flying objects, but when they land on the ground and people see things, we don't really cover that. I think it should be covered, but do you think that's something that will generate more interest as this disclosure, soft disclosure, occurs?
I think that I think the conversation is gonna have to follow the science on it, right? So,
Right.
few assumptions baked in there. Words like craft and things of that nature. Um, we're going through efforts to work on better detection, which is going to lead to better characterization and better evaluation of these objects. And some of these objects might turn out to be X, but some of them might turn out to be Y. And if they're Y, that might leave the possibility open for these objects to be considered craft or have objects in them or things. And again, it's about following the science. We're just not in a position where we could categorize these as craft or having hollow centers for occupants or anything that detailed at this point. So I to your point, it's wherever the conversation takes us, we have to have the conversation, and that's something we haven't done in the past, right? We haven't had the opportunity to look at the data. We haven't had an opportunity to do the science, and we haven't had an opportunity to really understand what the conclusions could be from that. And so we're left kind of hoping and waiting, and wishing what it could be, but we're going to be moving in the right direction now. We're going to be doing so in a public manner. At least that's what I'm endeavoring to do. And that's, I think, the best we can ask for right now.
Right.
Yeah. Recently,
Well
we've
said.
had these lots of talk in the news of things in our airspace and flying around, and you were recently on CNN, and as they tried to kind of water it down, I love your quote. It's like, we have a real UFO problem, not just balloons. And it was a way, I think, to kind of regain that power of saying, no, no, you're not going to do this again. And just say, no, no, maybe it's balloons, or this is like swamp gas 2.0 from the 60s or whatever. Right. So what are your thoughts on kind of media and how they portray it? Are they taking it more seriously? I mean, even guys like James Fox, movie makers, have been on CNN talking about the phenomenon. So what was it like for you to be on CNN, and what do you think it really means, the fact that they're willing to put you on and have you give your opinion?
Yeah, I think I think the conversation has changed a lot. So, I mean, I remember being on CNN in 27, no, no, 2018 or 2019, but, and, lead in with the X Files music and, wow, just very kind of like, well, we'll hear it out. And that's pretty wild type story. But, um, we've seen the conversation mature quite a bit over that time. And with the recent shoot downs, I think it's important to consider that how the story evolved, right? So we started with the Chinese balloon that was discovered by civilian photographers, or at least it was leaked that way, and then we presumably have been tracking it the whole time, and then we shot it down. Then we've communicated this publicly, that we then lowered the speed filters on our radar systems to look for slower speed objects, which resulted in us seeing some. I have to assume we saw more than three, but we elected to shoot down three. Um, we weren't able to find those objects. There's no imagery of those objects yet, and the pilots did not seem able to easily describe the objects. In public statements from the president on down, there's been a very clear bifurcation between the Chinese balloon and whatever these three objects are. I don't know what they are. I don't know if they are what we were seeing off the East Coast. We were seeing slow objects, 0.0, 1 Mach, but those objects were stationary over the ground for long periods of time. My understanding, at least how it's been communicated publicly, is that these objects were drifting in the wind. At least that was the majority behavior. But what the point is isn't whether they're the same objects or whether they're not the same objects. The point is that we don't, I've been communicating for a number of years that we don't have as much certainty about what's above our head as we thought we did, and we're seeing that fact play out in real time with these shoot downs. And what these shoot downs did, it seems to have provided the opportunity for the Aero leadership to brief members of Congress and Senate, and regardless of what those three balloons or those three objects are, it's so easy to do.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Whatever those three objects end up being, Aero still got the opportunity, I think, to brief the wider issue and the scope of it. And I think that's what a lot of those senators were reacting to when they came out of those briefings. And so this just goes to the point, we need to understand what these objects are. We can't just blow them off because they're some debunkers or skeptics like to just say, oh, well, they're balloons. I've been saying from the very beginning, that's not an excuse to ignore this issue. If there's potential adversary intelligence gathering platforms, then we need to, treat this as a national security issue. And if there's something there that we can't identify, we need to treat it with scientific curiosity. Something might fall out of that ends up turning into a national security issue, right? So we need to be vigilant on those objects. We can't just assume because we don't identify it, everything's hunky-dory there. So we need to be curious. We need to investigate those things and, try to figure out what it's not, even if we can't figure out what it is.
Yeah. And
If
even
you were, sorry, Jay, I was just going to say, just because you're talking about what it could be or could not, I like to ask everybody their own opinion. And obviously it's a ventured guess because nobody knows. But what do you think, in your imagination, what makes sense to you? What do you think's actually going on?
So, man, I've come to the conclusion that there's something anomalous going on. So what that means, I don't know yet. My goal essentially is to make the bucket around that anomalous nugget as small as possible. So remove all the junk out of there, remove the adversarial platforms, remove the the potential for commercial platform in the U.S. or anything like that. And once we do that, I think the methodology and the science and the way we approach the problem has to change then at that point when we've reached a certain confidence level, because we need to go back to a first principles approach in a way that I think you can't necessarily do when you're looking for adversarial programs or things of that nature. and so I think there's a couple tiers of how this conversation is going to unfold. So for me, I'm still in that first part of the conversation where we're still trying to pull things out, but it's very clear that there is this core that's going to remain as we keep pulling things out, because some of the behaviors that we seem to be seeing uh, are bizarre enough that there's some low hanging fruit, you could say, where it's like, all right, that's probably not going to wash out as an adversarial threat. But again, that once we have clearly identified that and parameterized it, then it's a time to start looking at it in a different manner and say, okay, what conclusions can we draw from this? Maybe that'll be an easy process, maybe it won't, but it'll be a different process. And no, that's a super unsatisfying answer. I'm sorry.
You believe in aliens or don't you believe in aliens?
I certainly believe that there's a potential for it, right?
Yeah.
So space doesn't stop at some magical number above our heads. We are part of this universe, and it's very likely that this universe has other intelligent life other than us. And I think it would be silly to think that they'd be limited to the means of traveling around the universe that we can currently technologically achieve. So I think that possibility is certainly on the table.
It's the peak of human ignorance to think that it's just us. We know everything. And I mean, our actions demonstrate that we actually believe that as a species in general. Obviously some of us are more open-minded than others. Some of us are, dictator type mentalities, and those people find the roles in life that they're suited towards. But yeah, if we do believe in creation and anything to do with quantum physics or the consciousness level, creation wouldn't just be so limited as to put a couple life forms on a pale blue dot somewhere on the planet, right? So open mind is good. And I appreciate you saying that, because we have chatted with some military people, kind of the old guard military guys that have been retired for a couple decades, and they still think that it's ours, it's China, it's Russia. They've either been so kind of ingrained or trained that way, like don't go there, it's crazy. And for them, it's hard to shed that taboo. So you guys are kind of like the perfect age, the perfect level of experience and open-mindedness that I think you can really make this happen. So
Having your own experiences helps too.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's hard for people to, especially I would say, the cohort that you just identified, to believe things so far removed from their life experiences that they've, experienced their whole life. They're much more ingrained in their own reality.
Yeah.
I was a fighter pilot for 8 months before we started seeing weird stuff. I mean, the majority of my career, since we upgraded the radars, myself and others. So this was normal for me and for us. That was my reality. That was what we experienced. And so I understand it can be hard to adjust without hard data.
Yeah.
I like the coexistence theory that Hal put out there recently, just saying that maybe these things have been around for a long time. We did mention before on the podcast, but I'll just say it again. They're discovering that apes are slowly entering the Stone Age. They're discovering how to make sharp sticks and fish for food, and they're discovering this stuff. They're evolving. And what if that happened to us? It's just we happen to be the apes to whatever this species is. They get to monitor us. But the minute we start blowing each other up with nukes, it drew their attention, because now it affected them personally, the same way as it would if apes started playing around with nukes. We would be watching them. It's no different. And I love that theory that maybe we've been coexisting with these things. Maybe that's why they're here. We're just got better technology to detect them now. And it's interesting because that opens up a whole new world of questions, right? We keep saying, are we alone? Well, we had different human species live among us for such a long time. They all died out, but we weren't alone. There was others. So I think it's a laughable question when people say, are we alone in the universe? Like, are you kidding me? Probably when we find out the magnitude of intelligent life out there, it'll be the most laughable quote or question that we've ever asked, right? But that's my hopes. That's my hopes and dreams. Let's talk a bit about Merged, your podcast. So you're bringing on pilots and scientists on the show. You got a scientific inquiry and a radically open-minded approach is the slogan that you have on your website. And I love that, because basically you're opening up the table. You're opening up the conversation for people to come down, have a cup of coffee, and talk about what they've seen, and you're giving them that platform. So how did that come about?
Yeah, it was just, another need that I identified. I took my risk as a pilot to communicate on this topic. But I know and a lot of other pilots had seen things, whether it was the same things I had experienced or whether it was their own personal stories from their time flying, back long ago. And so I knew there was this, incredible amount of information. And one of the things I've heard a lot over the past few years is, why is it just Ryan talking about this if it's so common? Um, and primarily what I've been hearing is just people just don't want to risk their career and go on. And no offense, but a like UFO only topic that is like foreign to them, that they're not into. Um, it's just, I think people have been hesitant to go on those because they are afraid how it's going to reflect on their career as an aviator. They have fear that they could lose their careers. It's not just losing your job, it's
Right.
losing your career. I mean, you lose your medical license. What do you do? You start over in your 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, to
Brutal.
try a new career. I mean, it can be tough, and there's really no upside to doing that. So, I said, hey, can I provide a place that is reliable and a known quantity for these aviators that aren't going to feel like they're going to be overly risking something by coming on here, and we can have a conversation, pilot to pilot, about their experiences, and not try to draw conclusions about their experiences or anything else, but just kind of just hear them out and just show people that these things are much more common than they thought. It's just pilots haven't felt comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
Right.
We've
And
heard
this,
recently that they have, whistleblower protections now. And I've said it on a few different shows that we've been on. People asked, and I said, well, that's great. Maybe it legally means they can't fire you, but there's no reputation protection in that. So yeah, it's great. You can go and testify, and maybe there's a little more room there than there was, but it still doesn't change what your peers think of you. It still doesn't mean that as a former military guy, you may not get a job as a commercial pilot now because people think you're a little out there. So it's good. I mean, it's better than not having that protection for these people that want to come forward, but there really is nothing to safeguard reputation unless you get rid of ignorance. Once people stop looking at people funny, then it's safe. Until then, you can have as many legalities and as many bills as you want to say you're safe to do that, but people talk, and it's a cultural thing. We're humans. This is not black and white. So
yeah.
There's
there's
another way
nothing
around it.
really.
You can make it anonymous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so let me just kind of, there's 2 points I want to make here. One is pilots are not covered under the whistleblower protection laws that went into place with the National Defense Authorization Act of 2023.
I did not know
So
that.
that's
Yeah, I
about
didn't
defense
either.
contractors and things of that nature. So nothing to do with pilots, unless they happen to be a pilot on a very illegal program type setup. But that's a vast minority, I would imagine, if any. But what about commercial pilots?
Yeah.
So that's actually one of the things that we're looking at doing with the ASA, Americans for Safe Aerospace. One of probably our first policy positions will be to introduce legislation or work legislation to provide those protections to pilots in the commercial markets in the United States, to be able to report that without fear of losing their jobs.
So the stigma is still very much still around, even though we have all these developments that or at least acceptance of the phenomenon happening. Is that stigma still out there in the aviation industry?
It's breaking, but it's breaking up from, at least what I hear, at least to some degree, amongst the pilots. But there's still that fear that on the company side is different, because in like a major like airline, it's like the pilots and it's a strong union, and then it's like the corporate guys, and they're
Right.
not too mixed up. So I think it's loosening up in the pilot side, but there's not too much interaction there. I mean, so I know one airline that has issued cease and desist to pilots not to talk about it, as well as made general statements to all their air crew not to engage publicly on it or discuss it publicly. So there's definitely stigma, and I think even maybe less stigma and just like kind of uncertainty too, right? Like I think we are making that transition. We're in that transitioning phase, and so there's uncertainty, but maybe not that deep, stigma and shame that has been.
Right, because it
I'm
ruined people's life in the past. Like, if you came out in the 80s or 90s with any sightings, they just, like you mentioned, they'd ruin your life. Like, you weren't able to fly anymore. people thought you were crazy. You were that UFO guy. There was nothing to basically support these people that have had these sightings. There was no encouragement at all for anybody to report these, whether it was civilian or Air Force or, people in the military. But now it's coming forward that actually it's been decades of sort of like I've been silenced, and I want to be vocal about what I've seen, what we've experienced, and it's amazing the amount of sightings and experiences that people have had. And now it's military, Air Force. Well, not I can't stop saying Air Force, Navy, and other departments that are coming forward and saying, "Look, we're having a problem with this." The Air Force is still silent on this issue, which is really frustrating. They're not, they got to be encountering things as well. Again, I'm not going to ask you what you think the opinions are on that one, because you probably don't know any more than we do. But it's disconcerting at this point that we haven't heard anything from them really, and that they're not looking into a UFO program, as far as I know. What do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'll just say I don't have any thoughts. I just say it's becoming increasingly obvious the Air Force is absent to this conversation,
Right.
And increasingly stubborn. There's there's a good and a bad way of interpreting the recent interagency. I think they called it a task force that the White House announced related to this. The optimistic view is that this will provide more leverage and authority through the Aero office, assuming they're aligned, to be able to affect change. Perhaps that might help in that regard.
Right.
Have you heard of anything in terms of infighting? Like, and I'll give you an example. A friend of our show, Ross Coulthard, he has his own show with Bryce Zabel, and he would mention that the Navy, at least this is what he'd heard from one of his sources, that the Navy is upset because they know the Air Force has certain information. In some cases, they know it because they have similar information themselves. And it's almost like the Air Force is controlling the narrative. This is, again, as per his source, but they're trying to paint the picture that the Air Force is in control of all this. And they're even filtering what makes it to the Pentagon and makes it to the White House. And that somehow they are trying to control this narrative. And that's sort of the disconnect between the Navy and the Air Force that is rumored to be happening. Have you heard anything about interdepartmental, things happening, people not getting along, agendas?
Yeah, I'd say I've heard generally that, and that would not surprise me if that was the case.
Yeah. At
Well
this point,
said.
at this point, they've been way too silent. It almost makes them look guilty. When you come home and your dog's done something bad and the ears are back, he's not letting you know what he did, but he did something. That's kind of like
You just haven't found the mess yet.
yeah, exactly. It's waiting for you upstairs. Yeah, and so the Americans for Safe Aerospace, that was just launched, and it looks like you're doing really well right now. Again, this is something that you brewed up. Well, I wouldn't say recently. I don't know how long you've had this idea in mind, but when did that come about, and how fast did things move for you?
Well, we've been kind of identifying the need, and I've been doing the legwork that we'll start doing with the ASA, which to a greater degree, which is trying to get op-eds published to bring this message out wider, to communicate with people in DC on Capitol Hill. And it was a one-man shop. I was going and doing it myself, and trying to ensure that the legislation that was being moved forward had the best interest of this topic in mind. And there's a need for guidance and expertise to advise people as they come into this topic space, both people on Capitol Hill, elected officials, as well as the general public. And that need has been something I've been trying to fill for a while. And this is a mechanism where we can do it in a more controlled manner, where we can gather data and we can, make our pitch to Congress to say, hey, here's why you need to care about this, because all your constituents do.
Yeah, I checked out your website yesterday and I love it. The first thing that popped up on your homepage was join the fight for transparency. And I love the fact that that's your mission statement, not to define this or to disprove somebody else's theory, but let's just be transparent about it. It is what it is. Let's all be adults and let's just remove those layers of haze, because that's really what's getting in the way of real progress. So good on you for that.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I just want to say to our viewers and to you, Ryan, as well, that I don't know if you've recently seen this. It's a CTV release, so it's in Canada. So I don't know if that it's spread to the States yet. But Canada's recently started a new UFO study. So it's been nearly 30 years since Canada has actually looked into this. And so they're doing that now. The project is called Sky Canada Project, and it's the Office of the Chief Science Advisory of Canada that is in charge of this program. So they gave it to the scientists. They didn't give it to the military. I'm not knocking the Canadian military down. We got good men and women in there, but we do not have the technology to study this stuff. It's I've said that before. We need help in that department for sure. But supposedly there's a 9-page presentation that is currently circulating within the federal organizations, such as Transport Canada, which is the main hub where pilots can actually report something, and they release everything online. The Canadian Space Agency and the RCMP, which is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. In Canada is like the equivalent of the CIA. So anyways,
The
that's
FBI. It would be the FBI.
Oh, FBI, yeah.
Canada, we have CSIS, which is like the CIA.
Keep forgetting about those guys. They're good. They're so good.
I only know this because I had a friend who worked for them.
Nice.
Pretty cool stuff.
But he couldn't tell you about it without killing you, right?
He drove me past. I used to live in Ottawa, which is Canada's capital city, and he drove me past. It looked like about the footprint of what a school would have, with shrubs that were like 30 feet high, and it just looked like a wall of trees, perfectly trimmed. I said, "What the hell's behind that?" He goes, "It's Canadian Secret Service." He's like, "They will see and hear you within a certain radius of even being in the area." So that's my little bit on being as close to CIA as possible. That and Jim Semivan, who worked for the CIA. That was a cool day as well. So, but this has also been a great day. But yeah, finish your point, Jay, on the Canadian.
I was just going to say as my last question. It's a global issue. The Americans are sort of leading the way here in leadership into looking into this. Canada's finally paying attention as well. We're throwing the scientists at it. What do you think we need to do to bring this to a global platform to say, hey, we have a global problem here? Because if it's none of us, it's something else, and we should unite to at least figure out what the hell it is. Until we figure it out, we don't know, and it could be a threat. What would encourage? What do you think would be needed to encourage the rest of the world to start paying attention to this?
Well, I think we need to be careful. A lot of the world, I think, might already be paying more attention to than us, at least the average American. So I know there's some great work in France. I know there's some great work in South America. I mean, there's probably I'm not that well versed on all the different groups. I know there's one in Italy as well, but so I think there has been a little bit more of a history of this internationally. But how do we kind of bring it to the forefront in a way that we can move the ball forward? I think as a global community. Honestly, I think we can do it with the same conversation that we're having in the U.S., right? We have air traffic everywhere on this planet, and I think every country in this world wants to avoid, their citizens having an air incident, and also every country in this world, wants to have sovereignty over their own airspace as well. And so I think this issue, whether it's national security or something for scientific interests and air safety, that every country is going to have a stake in that. And so I think through international standards, through ICAO and other international aviation safety mechanisms, that we can expand that conversation internationally, as well as be able to perhaps bring data in from those international reporting channels in a manner that allows for a collation of international data that perhaps we haven't had before.
Right.
Amazing. Well, before we let you go, Ryan, we want to ask where can people follow you and find your amazing work?
Yeah, it's at merge_podcast on YouTube for the YouTube or for the podcast, and for safeaerospace.org for the Americans for Safe Aerospace. That'd be the best place. And you can also find me on Twitter at Uncertain Vector.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate your time. We know you're a busy guy and you're doing a lot of interviews today. Thank you for sparing some time with us and our audience.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's interesting to hear these little tidbits we didn't know, i.e. the pilots can't, testify. They don't have that whistleblower protection. So it's awesome when we get new information. And again, thanks very much for everything you're doing just for the movement and for information in general. And we'd love to have you back anytime you want to come back.
All right, Louis. Thank you so much, Jason. It's a pleasure. You guys
It's
have a
been
good
fun.
weekend.
You too.